The world was dreaming, but the heart of the global economy had just stopped beating. Inside the clearinghouse, the alarms didn't just scream, they cut into a dead digital hush. On the settlement dashboard, green lights began turning gray, one by one, like drowning stars. Outside, the city still looked normal, but the air felt charged, metallic, wrong. Money had stopped moving, and the world simply didn't notice yet. In a quiet data hall, the first automated fail-safes triggered. The system tried to save itself from itself. Routing tables flipped, redundancy paths engaged, and transaction queues began to stack like sandbags against a rising flood. Then the queue hit the ceiling. It overflowed. That was the first crack. The kind nobody hears because it happens under glass. Security consoles flagged a cascade of invalid signatures. The keys to the kingdom suddenly belonged to someone else. It looked like sabotage, but it felt like physics, like gravity, was finally being applied to a world built on debt. In the halls of power, the smell of coffee and printer toner was replaced by the cold sweat of people lying to themselves. When the central bank asked if the rot was contained, the answer arrived like a punch to the gut. All rails are down, sir, and it's spreading. The first symptom appeared at a gas station. A night shift worker tried to buy fuel, but the screen looped a cheery error message. He tried another card, then cash, then stared at the clerk like betrayal had a face. The clerk just shrugged, not knowing that a single shrug is the start of a stampede. Cell networks began to choke as human reflex turned into panic. The tower saturated, and the silence took control. This is the darkest financial secret. Trust is a finite fuel. By mid-morning, the word bank holiday appeared in secure chats, only to be scrubbed and replaced with stability pause. They used language to disinfect fear. But as the markets flickered like bad neon, the truth became undeniable. This wasn't a glitch. It was a trust layer attack. They didn't just take the money, they took the idea of authenticity itself. Now, the government's panic is invisible, sealed behind encryption. They talk about contagion while watching heat maps of your withdrawal attempts like meteorologists watching a storm. The safest place for your money is now a cage. Every assurance statement is a political choice. Every delay is a signal. Your wealth is no longer an asset. A story with no narrator. The Great Depression didn't end in the 1930s. It just went digital, waiting for the right moment to delete the exit button. When the machine asks you for trust tomorrow, ask yourself, what does that trust actually buy you? Because in this new normal, paper wealth isn't a metaphor anymore. It's a sentence. In the gap, rumor breeds faster than signal. By 5:34, the first ATMs hard freeze and display the same bland sentence everywhere. Service unavailable. It says, like an apology from a machine that cannot feel shame. A commuter taps the screen, then hits it, then laughs, once, sharp and ugly. He walks away with empty hands, and the camera in the kiosk keeps recording anyway. At 5:58, a bank branch manager receives an internal directive marked Red Tier Urgent. It instructs staff to delay opening, lock secondary doors, and avoid public statements. The manager reads it twice, because the words are too heavy to hold at once. Then he notices a second message. Prepare for holiday protocol. At 6:07, the phrase bank holiday appears in a secure chat, then vanishes from it. Someone replaces it with stability pause, as if language can disinfect fear. The markets are not open yet, but the pre-market indicators already flicker like bad neon. Every flicker is a warning that confidence is a finite fuel. At 6:22, the catalyst becomes visible inside the grid Operators Network. SCADA command logs show legitimate credentials issuing illegitimate instructions, timed perfectly to evade alarms. Voltage regulators obey phantom orders, then snap back, then obey again, like a puppet with many hands. The grid does not fall, but it begins to stutter, and stutter is enough. At 6:41, the intelligence briefing lands on the table, stamped with a classification that tastes like dread. Analysts describe a trust layer attack aimed at signatures, timestamps, and the idea of authenticity itself. They do not claim certainty about the actor, because certainty would create obligations. Outside the room, phones buzz with news alerts that still insist everything is fine. At 7:03, the first television anchor smiles too brightly and says minor outages behind the anchor. A ticker scrolls numbers that no longer match anything real. The studio's producers receive a quiet warning from regulators. Do not inflame deposit behavior. The anchor keeps smiling, and the smile becomes a weapon pointed at the public. At 7:18, foreign desks begin calling, asking why settlement confirmations are not arriving. A European Central Bank requests a status report on dollar liquidity, and the reply is delayed. The delay is interpreted as a signal, because in crises, silence always means something. Across Auchan's contingency rooms light up, and alliance maps shift into new shapes. At 7:37, the president authorizes the first step of the trigger response. It is not declared as a crisis, but as a temporary protective measure. Payment rails are ordered into a controlled freeze to prevent further contamination. The freeze is meant to be surgical, but the patient is the whole body. At 7:49, the National Cybersecurity Director argues for pulling the country off global routing tables. The telecom chiefs protest, because disconnection is a kind of military protocol officers remain quiet because they know what isolation looks like during war. The argument ends with a compromise that satisfies nobody and buys almost no time. At 8:02, a terse executive order is signed, written in legal language that hides its teeth. It grants emergency authority to restrict withdrawals, suspend transfers, and mandate reporting thresholds. The order references older statutes, dusty clauses, built for enemies and repurposed for citizens. The pen lifts, and the room understands that a line has been crossed. At 8:14, the first phase of confusion spreads through offices and kitchens and street corners. People refresh banking apps, and the apps spin endlessly, like a coin that never lands. Customer service lines play soothing music over the sound of a system drowning. On social media, screenshots of errors become proof of a conspiracy, then proof of betrayal. At 8:29, the government's panic remains invisible, sealed behind access badges and encryption. Inside the Situation Room, officials speak about contagion, capital flight, and the velocity of fear. They watch heat maps of withdrawal attempts, like meteorologists watching a storm form over warm water. They know the public is calmer than the state, and that fact terrifies them. At 8:47, the first banks refuse to open their lobbies, citing technical maintenance. Security guards stand with hands clasped, eyes forward, trained to absorb anger without reacting. A woman with a paycheck to cash presses her palm to the glass and mouths a question. The guard does not answer, because there is no answer that does not ignite. At 9:06, the markets opened into a controlled halt, like a race that never begins. Trading algorithms detect abnormal settlement risk and pull liquidity back into hiding. Bid-ask spreads widen until they become a chasm, and the chasm looks like the future. The public sees a red screen, but officials see a map of cascading failures. At 9:22, the first assurance statement is drafted and rewritten 6 times. One version admits a cyber event. Another blames routine maintenance. Another blames foreign interference. Each rewrite is a political choice that shapes survival odds for millions. In the end, they choose calm words because calm words are cheaper than truth. At 9:40, the first major supermarket experiences an invisible change in human behavior. The shelves are full, but carts begin moving faster with less eye contact. A man buys bottled water like he is stocking for a siege, not a weekend. The cashier watches the line grow and feels the old world thinning. At 9:58, fuel stations begin switching to manual mode, then discover manual mode requires cash. Cash becomes a rumor, then a commodity, then a cause of fights. The station owner tapes a handwritten sign to the window, and the sign feels medieval. Drivers honk, not to complain, but to release pressure they cannot name. At 10:13, the breakdown becomes audible as sirens, not from disaster, but from disorder. Police respond to the first bank line scuffle, then the second, then the 10th. Dispatchers report crowd agitation with the same tone used for storms. The crowds are not criminals yet, but they are becoming a force. At 10:31, the grid stutter deepens as load balancing systems misread corrupted telemetry. A substation trips, then another, and neighborhoods flicker into and out of power. Elevators hold between floors, trapping people with strangers and the taste of metal fear. The city does not go dark, but it begins to blink like a dying animal. At 10:52, hospitals switch to generator readiness because hospitals always sense the shift first. Fuel supply contracts depend on electronic invoices, and electronic invoices depend on the rails. Administrators begin counting physical supplies, like they are counting days. In the neonatal ward, machines keep breathing for babies, indifferent to politics. At 11:09, the central bank convenes an emergency liquidity committee, and nobody smiles. They debate reopening in clean mode, using offline ledgers and delayed settlement windows. An engineer explains the risk. Any reopened channel becomes a reinfection vector. A governor asks, quietly, what happens if they never reopen? At 11:27, foreign governments hold their own crisis calls, some with allies, some without. A NATO secure line hums with coded language and the brittle politeness of mutual suspicion. No one wants to say Article 5, but everyone wants to know the threshold. A financial strike looks like war now, even when no missile flies. At 11:45, the president records a national address, and the lighting is designed for trust. The teleprompter displays simple metaphors about plumbing, pipes, and temporary closures. The president's voice stays steady, but the pauses reveal the strain underneath. Across the nation, people listen and hear what they fear, not what is said. At 12:03, the address airs, and the key line is repeated everywhere within minutes. The safest place for your money is inside the system. The president insists, present tense, absolute. The sentence is meant to be a bridge, but it lands like a command. In living rooms, people glance at each other, and trust becomes a private negotiation. At 12:21, regulators announce withdrawal limits to ensure fairness, a phrase that always means scarcity. Banks are instructed to honor small cash requests, but deny large transfers without review. The review process is slow by design, because slowness is a dam against panic. The dam holds for hours, and hours feel like years. At 12:39, the first black market exchange rate for physical cash appears in a group chat. It lists premiums for small bills, higher premiums for clean bills, and absurd premiums for coins. A teenager with a backpack becomes a liquidity provider, and nobody laughs. When official rails freeze, unofficial rails grow teeth. At 1:02 p.m., the darkest secret begins to emerge inside policy circles. They know the system is not failing because there is no money, but because there is no trust. Trust is the hidden collateral behind every deposit, every bond, every promise. When trust is attacked at the signature layer, wealth becomes a story with no narrator. At 119, the Treasury's war room drafts the next step, more severe, more permanent. They propose a mandatory conversion window into a new emergency digital instrument. The instrument is pitched as stability, but its true purpose is visibility and control. If they can see the flows, they can tax the flows, and they can freeze them. At 137, legal counsel warns about constitutional limits, then offers workarounds in the same breath. Emergency powers are like crowbars. They fit any door if pressure is high enough. The council recommends voluntary compliance backed by penalties that make it involuntary. The room nods because legality in crisis is often just choreography. At 158, the breakdown reaches the payroll cycle, and employers begin improvising. Some companies issue paper checks, then discover paper checks cleared through frozen rails. Others offer store credit, meal vouchers, fuel chits, anything that resembles value. Workers accept, not because they believe, but because hunger is not ideological. At 217, schools receive guidance to remain open because open schools signal normalcy. Teachers arrive, but parents keep children home because parents sense the predator behind the curtain. The playground is quiet, and the quiet is heavier than sirens. A society that stops sending children out is a society bracing for impact. At 239, a city council orders police overtime, and the officers' faces harden. They are trained for riots, but not for systemic betrayal. They stand near banks and grocery stores, enforcing a peace that feels temporary. The uniform becomes both protection and target, depending on which side hunger chooses. At 301, the government deploys mobile cash units with armed escorts, like relief convoys. The units distribute limited bills to qualified recipients based on identity verification. Verification requires databases, and databases require power, and power is now uncertain. When the machine asks for trust, people ask what trust buys them. At 326, the first information gap becomes a weapon used by everyone. Officials insist the attack is contained, while internal memos describe uncontrolled spread. Influencers claim the entire system is a planned demolition, and their certainty sells. Information at this moment is poison disguised as clarity. At 354, the infrastructure collapse turns specific, mechanical, humiliating. Gas pumps lock because authorization pings never return and the pumps refuse to guess. Pharmacies cannot verify insurance, so they demand cash, and cash is rare. Traffic lights flash red, and drivers negotiate intersections with eye contact and fear. At 418, the first neighborhood mutual aid groups form, not from ideology, but from a nurse trades medical advice for canned food. Because expertise is a currency too, an electrician offers generator wiring in exchange for fuel, because light becomes leverage. Community becomes a microgrid when the macrogrid wavers. At 444, the new normal begins to crystallize, and it is not announced. Those who prepared have radios, water, cash, and routines that do not depend on apps. Those who did not prepare begin learning under pressure, and pressure is a brutal teacher. The separation is not moral. It is logistical. At 509, the invisible threat is no longer just cyber, but societal. It is the spread of distrust through families, workplaces, and friend groups. People begin to suspect hoarding, lying, insider warnings, and preferential access. They are often correct, and correctness makes the poison stronger. At 533, the central bank attempts a partial reopening with a quarantined settlement window. They call it a clean corridor, using hardware rekied under armed supervision. Transaction volume returns in a thin trickle, then spikes, then crashes again. The corridor proves one thing: panic moves faster than any corridor can handle. At 5:58, the president receives a classified assessment of geopolitical blowback. An adversary blog denies involvement and offers humanitarian technical assistance with a smile. Allies demand attribution, because retaliation requires a name and a flag. The president sees the trap. Respond too hard and markets die. Respond too soft and enemies repeat. At 6:21, the military raises readiness posture, not because invasion is likely, but because accidents are misread. Signals in crisis produce overreactions, and overreactions produce fireworks. Pilots sit in cockpits on hot standby, listening to radios hiss like distant insects. The public does not see jets, but the sky feels watched. At 6:49, the darkest financial secret becomes policy. Stability requires confiscation of options, not confiscation of gold, not bars in vaults, but confiscation of exit itself. They cannot allow mass conversion into anything the state cannot monitor. So they target the most visible assets, because visibility makes enforcement cheap. At 7:13, a new directive orders mandatory reporting of physical cash holdings over a threshold. The directive is framed as anti-crime, but it functions as anti-flight. Compliance is requested, but non-compliance triggers audits, fines, and asset freezes. The state does not seize first. It intimidates first, because intimidation scales. At 7:36, brokerage accounts are placed under enhanced review, and transfers are delayed indefinitely. Retirement funds are protected by preventing withdrawals, because protection is another word for lock. People who need cash now discover their wealth is theoretical. Trapped behind a policy memo, the phrase paper wealth stops being a metaphor and becomes a sentence. At 8:02, the emergency digital instrument is announced, and it arrives with a promise of convenience. It is a temporary wallet, officials insist, designed to distribute relief and restore commerce. Merchants are pressured to accept it, because accepting it keeps them open.